Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, I am so excited to be able to have Dr. Tony Costa back onto the stream. We had a great session last time talking about Muhammad and the satanic verses, and this time around, it was kind of an impromptu thing, but I basically reached out to him and I wanted to see if we could discuss this idea of Christian persecution. I mean, just generally around the world, it's been a very crazy time, but especially when you zero in on what's been going on to the Christian community all over the world, you start to realize that this is a very big issue and a big topic that should be discussed, as well as from various realms. And so that's what we're planning to do today. So as you can see in the title, I titled it Communism and Islam in relation to Christian persecution. And our goal for today was basically to look at what Islam says about Christian persecution and how we can look at what the sources say in relation to how they're treated, as well as looking at things from a more atheistic standpoint as well, from regimes such as the Chinese Communist Party, who persecutes their Christians as well. And so our goal is basically just to understand why these groups are doing what they were doing, as well as how we can best respond to this. So, Tony, any introductory words you want to say, or?
Yeah, well, Christian persecution is probably the primary problem with our media is they don't report on Christian persecution. It's something that is left in the back burner. Almost every week, Christians in Nigeria are being slaughtered by Al-Shabaab and various Muslim terrorist groups. And we hear Christians being persecuted in China, in North Korea. We hear the slaughter of Christians when ISIS was in power, for example. And what you'll notice in our media is there's a tendency to virtually ignore all of this. And when the Christchurch, New Zealand mosque shooting occurred, it made frontline news. It was everything CNN talked about for weeks. The Prime Minister of New Zealand even started wearing a hijab and started joining in the Muslim prayers, and she started trying to appease the Muslim community in New Zealand. But when the same thing happens with Christians being persecuted or massacred, we hear next to nothing. And so Christianity truly is the most persecuted religion on the face of the earth today. And Open Doors, which is a Christian ministry that monitors Christian persecution around the world, every year they put out a chart, a list of countries where Christians are persecuted. And they have a list of 60 top countries. And number one, has been for a while, number one is North Korea. North Korea is the number one country in the world that persecutes Christians. And notice see if you can notice a trend here, Ayo.
I'm going to pull it up real quick, and we can look at it side by side.
Perfect. So yeah, Open Doors, USA.org. Yeah, and if you look up the persecution chart, then our viewers can also watch along.
Should be right here.
Perfect.
Here we go. Okay, let me just share the screen, and you guys should be able to see it.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
Yeah, perfect. If you go to page 10, if you go down to page 10, you'll notice there's a chart there.
Here we go.
On page 10, there's North Korea, but if you go to page 10 or slide 10 rather, you'll notice there's a list. You just passed it, Ayo?
There we go.
Okay, just the one above that on 10, page 10. You'll notice number one is North Korea. And tell me if you see a pattern here, Ayo.
Okay, I'll try.
Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, Pakistan, Eritrea, Sudan, Yemen, Iran. Anything these countries have in common?
Oh yeah, they all seem to have a large Muslim population. They're affected by that ideology.
That's right. Now remember, India also has a large Muslim population as well, not just Hindu. But let's look at the next ones. Let's look at 11 and following. If we just go back up again.
Oh, my bad. Sorry.
That's okay. If we look at the next column, there's Syria, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Maldives, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, Uzbekistan, Myanmar, and Laos. Now, the majority of those countries, once again, there's a pattern there. They're all Muslim. Now, Myanmar is Burma. It's another name for Burma. And of course, Laos is a communist country. So North Korea, Myanmar, Laos are communist countries. So we're beginning to see a trend here. The places where Christians are most persecuted are, number one, Muslim countries, and number two, communist countries. Now, if we go to the next page, or slide 11 rather, you'll notice it continues there. And now we've got Vietnam. Vietnam is communist as well. And notice China is there as well. Yeah. Mauritania in Western Africa, the Central African Republic, Morocco, Qatar, Burkina Faso, Mali. Again, a lot of Muslims there. Sri Lanka, we also remember the church bombings that took place there. And Tajikistan, Nepal, Jordan, Tunisia. So if you notice very closely here, and then of course you've got other countries like Colombia, and then again Oman, Kuwait, Kenya. All of these countries, the majority of these countries are Muslim countries. So now we have to ask the question, what does Islam and communism have in common? And they have much in common. Islam and communism both have an authoritarian structure where you have one leader at the top. And so in the communist government, you have the chairman of the Communist Party. And then in Islam, you have the ruler. And according to the Quran, it does not accept democracy as a form of government. It does not accept even communism as a form of government, but it does accept Sharia law with one leader over the whole country. So what you also notice is in Islam and communism, there's no freedom of speech. So you cannot express yourself. You can't say, you know what, I think the Quran's a false book. It's and Muhammad's a false prophet. You can't say that. You don't have the freedom to leave communism and become a capitalist within a communist country and spread your ideas. In Islam, you cannot convert out of Islam on the pain of death. So you cannot convert. Apostasy is punishable by death. In communism, there's no freedom of the press. In Islam, there's no freedom of the press. In communism, there is no freedom of religion. In Islam, there is no freedom of religion, because Christians and Jews in particular, according to the Quran, chapter 9, verses 28 to 30, which is the last chapter that Muhammad received. It's the last revealed surah, the last chapter. The marching orders that Muhammad was given was fight and kill the Jews and the Christians until they submit. Now, in Muslim countries, you'll notice the reason why Jews and Christians are subjugated is because the Quran has a special term for them. The Quran refers to Jews and Christians as dhimmis, dhimmis. So it almost sounds like dummies, but the word dhimmis refers to subjugated people of the book. So the people of the book in the Quran refers to the Jews and the Christians. So according to Islamic law, Jews and Christians who come under the rule of Islam have three options. Number one, they convert to Islam and become Muslim. Number two, they become subjects and they pay a special tax. So the special tax is called the jizya, J-I-Z-Y-A. You Americans say Z, us Canadians say Z. So we don't want to argue about that. We certainly don't want another war of 1812. Oh. So the jizya is the special poll tax, the special tax that Jews and Christians pay to the Islamic ruler. So it's really protection money. But the word dhimmi means humiliated. It means subdued. So the whole idea is to humiliate Christians and Jews who live under Islamic rule. And the whole point is to force them to become Muslims. And the third choice, of course, is if you don't convert to Islam or if you don't choose to pay the special jizya, we will kill you. So those are the three options that Jews and Christians have. So you have to ask yourself this question, Ayo, why is it that in the Muslim world, there's virtually no Jews living in those countries? So think of Iraq, think of Iran, think of Syria, even Saudi Arabia. Think of any of these countries, their Jewish population is virtually nil. And that's because the Quran calls on warfare against them and so forth. And Christians, as you know, are heavily persecuted in these countries. Now, if you are a Hindu or a Buddhist, under Islamic law, you're a polytheist, and therefore you don't have those three choices that Jews, Christians have under Islamic rule. Their choice is convert or die because you're a polytheist. Yeah. So the
That's
reason
why it's
why
been kind of crazy in India as well, because they've had, I met a guy
exactly.
in college who was telling me how it's just insane over there with the conflicts that the Muslims
Yes.
and the Hindus are having, let alone from the
Yes.
Christians.
Yes. Even now, where there's a big fight about they want to build, the Hindus want to build a temple to one of their gods, and of course the Muslims are saying we're not going to allow any temples built here. So the whole idea is in Islam is to take the land you're living in and establish an Islamic state, and they won't rest until that becomes a reality. So Jews and Christians, particularly Christians, continue to suffer under Islamic rule. And Christians, on the other hand, Muslims are treated much more favorably in countries that have Judeo-Christian roots. So Saudi Arabia, for example, if you and I were to go to Saudi Arabia, number one, we cannot bring our Bibles into Saudi Arabia. It's illegal. If you're wearing a cross around your neck, they will confiscate it. You're not allowed to meet for worship. So there's no houses of worship other than mosques in Saudi Arabia. So no synagogues are permitted to be built, no Buddhist temples, no Christian churches, none of that. But then the same thing applies in communist countries. The first thing that Stalin did and Lenin did, the first thing that Castro did in Cuba and Pol Pot did in Cambodia, one of the first things they did was they attacked the churches. They killed the clergy. But in some countries like China, if you are a member of a church, you are encouraged to become registered with the government. And what that means is the Chinese government will monitor what you say, what you preach, and therefore churches that are registered with the government make a number of compromises. One of the things you cannot do, you can't talk about the kingdom of God, because that is a rival to the Communist Party of China.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so you cannot preach on Jesus being King of Kings, because there is no king but the Chinese, the chairman of the Chinese government, communist government. So as you can see, according to the list we just looked at Open Doors, the two main persecutors of Christians are communism and Islam.
So let me get your thoughts on a headline here real quick that I think directly relates to that, actually, regarding communism. Here's a headline from the Christian Post. Can you see it or no?
I think it's coming. I see it now.
Yeah. So China, 84-year-old Christian ordered to pray to Xi over God, cross replaced with images of the CCP ruler.
Right.
So this is basic. I mean, this was from August 14th, only a few days ago. And this is a prime example of what you're talking about. I mean, because that's a great point. As that, if I were Xi, I'd be thinking the same thing. Why would I want that rival that people are going to look to as opposed to me? They should be coming to me for their resources, for their satisfaction, whatever it is they need.
Right.
Because under this regime, I'm supposed to essentially be God. And so they can't tolerate any of these rivals, and it leads to extreme things like this. But you never hear about it in the news.
No, because you see, there's a narrative in the West. The narrative in the West is a view that is born out of what we call postmodernism and cultural Marxism. It's known today by its other cover. It's the word social justice. And the narrative is basically the two main enemies are Christianity and Judeo-Christian democratic systems. And therefore, according to the narrative that is being pushed in our media today in North America and in the West in general by the social justice so-called warriors, is that all the ills of society are to be put on Christians and Western democracy. And therefore, what you want to do is they're going to focus on everything that's bad about colonialism, and they'll bring up the slave trade, and they'll bring up the Crusades, and they will bring up the Native Americans, how they were slaughtered by these white European colonists, and they will bring up the nuclear family, which they see as an oppressive institution. So Black Lives Matter, for example,
I was going to say that.
Their statement of faith, their constitution, they actually say that we oppose the Western nuclear family as an oppressive identity. And that is alarming, because the nuclear family is basically the father, the mother, and the child, which is what God designed from the beginning. And they've openly admitted, the co-founders of Black Lives Matter openly admitted that they're practicing Marxists. And so you'll notice that in this view, nothing is said about Christian persecution. Nothing is said about the massacre of Christians in China. Nothing is said about this 84-year-old man being told to worship Chairman Xi and to have an image of him instead of having a cross. So why? Because it doesn't fit the narrative. But anything that fits the narrative comes into the mix, and therefore we need to be very careful, because this movement that is causing these riots in the United States and that is causing this trouble is born out of a Marxist worldview, and it is born out of a view that wants to basically smash down the present system, to smash it down and basically rebuild it from the bottom up. And that is Marxism to a T. That's exactly what Marx called for, the revolution, and then of course the promised utopian world. So yeah, you'll see that going on even in the United States, where they were calling for the destruction of churches, or they were interrupting worship services and so forth. All of these things are, again, born out of a worldview that hates God, because Marxism is anti-God and it's anti-Christ. And therefore, it's no surprise that people outside the Portland, Oregon courthouse about a week or so were burning Bibles. That's not surprising at all. Not surprising.
Burning Bibles, but not Qurans. You know, What Do You Meme just made a video about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, some insignificant pastor in Florida, Terry Jones, says we're going to have a burn the Quran day, and everyone went ballistic. The media went crazy, and even President Obama got involved and said this is not a wise thing to do. And this is like a pastor of a church of 20 people.
Yeah, all of a sudden he's on the front page.
Yeah, he's on the front page of every newspaper, and so he calls for the destruction of the burning the Quran day, and the whole, even the government, the United States government got involved. But we burned Bibles. Well, that's not really newsworthy. So don't be mistaken. Christianity is on the target here. And there's going to be more persecution coming. I mean, we saw with Grace Community Church with Pastor John MacArthur, where the California Court of Appeals overruled the order of a lower court. But it's totally fine to protest. You can go out and protest, and no need to have social distancing there. Up here in Canada, in Toronto, we have a case of a strip bar here that had 550 people may have been infected with COVID. And I'm thinking, now, wait a minute, you can't gather in a house of worship to worship God on a Sunday morning, but strip bars are okay?
Yeah.
So there's something wrong here. Protesting is fine. So you can have a BLM protest. No one's going to arrest you for, not practicing social distancing, not covering your face with a mask. But gathering in church to worship, you can't have that. So there's something really running amok here.
Yeah, it's like if you're gonna impose these things, at least be consistent. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
We won't like it anymore, but we'd at least appreciate it if you were legitimately consistent in your dealings. And one thing too, I wanted to point out, just something I've noticed, like on social media, is if there is one reason I have seen China kind of come more into the light regarding their persecution, it's been surrounding this whole issue of the Muslims who are in the concentration camps, and apparently they've been harvesting organs and all this really messed up stuff. And that's really messed up. I mean, I hope they put a stop to that. But again, it's just interesting to see how it doesn't really become a kind of hot issue until it affects more of a, I guess I'd say, just, I don't want to say politically correct minority, because Islam isn't exactly politically correct, but in terms of the mainstream perspective, it is. You'll see in terms of diversity, they try to push Islam, because many people who talk about what it actually teaches are labeled as Islamophobes. So it's kind of coddled by this mainstream culture. So because of that, when people started hearing about how the Chinese party was treating them in China, then it became this big deal, which again, I mean, they should call it out. It's messed up.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how nothing's said regarding Christians going on for decades. They probably, it's just insane. I don't know.
Well, the thing is, 60 years ago, we saw what happened in Nazi Germany. We've seen this before with concentration camps and so forth. And the world was absolutely horrified at what happened in those concentration camps. It's happening again. And it's happening to the Uyghurs, who are the Chinese Muslims in Northwest China. And we know it's happening. They've had drones film them where they're taking people into trains, and just like they did with the Jews in Nazi Germany, they're putting them into trains and shipping them off to labor camps, to work labor camps. And the Muslim world, for some reason, is quiet about this. You would think that Saudi would rise up and say, we condemn China for what they're doing to our brothers and sisters in the faith. Where is all the outrage from the Islamic world today? The United States, Guantanamo Bay, something is said about they flushed a Quran down the toilet. That makes headline news. Someone makes a picture of Muhammad. That makes headline news. So there's these poor Chinese Muslims who are being taken into concentration camps. Their wives are being raped, and organ harvesting does take place. I mean, the Chinese government is very unethical and immoral in this area, and the world is staying silent. And if someone says anything against China, like when President Trump referred to the coronavirus as the Chinese virus, everyone went berserk on him. But yet we talk about, they said, oh, you're mentioning an ethnic group. Well, what about German measles? That sounds ethnic. Flu. What about the Spanish flu? What about the West Nile virus? What about the Ebola virus that came out of Africa? What about these viruses like MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus that came out of the Middle East? But you'll notice that the world, when it comes to opening up and exposing China, the world becomes silent. The NBA is in their pocket.
Yeah, LeBron James and all that.
Yeah, LeBron James he knows where his bread is buttered, and so he will not condemn China for this. And even these terms, you brought up Islamophobia, and of course we have the word homophobia as well. And these are really empty terms. They're just politicized, empty terms. So when someone says to me, for example, that I've been called many things, but I can't repeat them on air. But one of the things I've been called is, "Oh, you're an Islamophobe," and what I do is I say, "Now wait a minute, Islamophobia. The word phobia is a Greek word that means to have an irrational fear of something, and Islam is Islamo, referring to the Islamic ideology. So, do I have when I criticize the Quran or I criticize Islam, does you're being Islamophobic? I said, well, I don't have an irrational fear of the Quran. I don't have an irrational fear of Muhammad. And I asked them this question: are you a Christophobe? And they'll say, well, what do you mean? Well, do you criticize the Bible? Well, yeah, you do, but does that make you a Christophobe? And they'll say, well, no. I said, well, why should I be an Islamophobe? And the same with homophobia. The same thing with homophobia. People say, oh, you're a homophobe. And I'll say, well, you're a heterophobe. And they'll say, what's heterophobia? I said, I don't know. What's homophobia? I mean, you don't have an irrational fear of heterosexuals, do you? And they'll say, oh, no. Why would I have an irrational fear of gay people? And so these are terms that they use to knock you down, to silence you, to censor you. So don't let them do that. If they try to say you're Islamophobic, then tell them, well, then you're being Christophobic. If they're saying you are homophobic, we'll just say, well, then I suppose you're being heterophobic. And these are useless terms. They're just made up to shut you down from saying what you believe is your conviction in this given matter.
I mean, even racism too. I mean, it's a real term, but it's been so overused that when it does get used, it minimizes actual instances of it because it's just so thrown around by people who want to throw you down. It's just crazy, that you say all that too. Losing my train of thought. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah. And so one thing I wanted to say was, also you see, I mean, in the most extreme sense, persecution can come in you losing your life. But in another sense, persecution can also come through, I don't want to say less hostile means, but just more subtle means that honestly can have just as much of an impact. So for example, if I show you this next headline right here, it says, Chinese government cracks down on all religious material in churches, must be approved by the communist regime. So we see this kind of breakaway from just the straight up taking of life, but we see this, I guess a good way to put it, especially from our Western standpoint, would be this kind of censorship. So, if you could comment on this, I mean, why is it that a communist regime would feel the need to officialize or, go over these materials before they're put out? And then also, do you see any kind of similar patterns regarding that here as well in the West?
Well, yes. You see, it all boils down to control, doesn't it? It's all about control, controlling information, controlling thoughts. And so this is really a Orwellian world where you're being condemned for thought crime and the thought police around you and so forth. So the reason why they do this is, as I mentioned earlier, is they want to vet all this material, because what they don't want is word to get out that, you know what, there's a better world coming, and that better world is not the utopia that the communists talk about, because all that's led to is starvation and massacre and genocide and so forth, and famine and so on. And so what the government will do is they will vet this material. In fact, you may not know this, Ayo, maybe you do, but the Communist Party of China is also putting out their own version of the Bible. What? So you're going to have, you're going to have a version of the Bible that is basically edited by the Communist Chinese Party. So what they're going to do is they're going to make Jesus look like a socialist or a communist, which he definitely was not. And what they will do is they will remove any references to the Lord, the idea of him being king, the idea of him being the sovereign, and so forth. So a passage like Philippians 10 to 11, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess, that is out. They will remove that from the New Testament. And so what it is, it's basically the vetting of material. Now, did something similar happen here in the West? And indeed it did. A number of years ago, the mayor of Houston, Texas, was demanding to see the sermon notes of the pastors who were preaching before Sunday. So wow. a mayor who happened to also be a lesbian, the mayor of Houston wanted to vet the sermons of these pastors. Now, when I first heard that, I thought it was maybe something from the Babylon Bee, or I thought it was probably the Onion, or it was probably, something you read on the National Enquirer as you're lined up at the cash at Walmart. And when I looked at that, I thought to myself, oh my heavens, I thought, is this the United States of America, the land of the free, and so forth? And so here we see examples where you're not allowed to express God's word in relation to sexual ethics. And then you have issues, for example, where parents are being condemned or charged for refusing to recognize their child's transgender identity.
There's that case going on right now with that kid James Younger, and like the mom who wants to transition him. It's crazy.
Yeah, and the father has to pay for the transitioning, the surgery, and all the costs and so forth.
8 years old.
Yeah. Now, what right does the government have to tell your family what to do, or to tell you? I mean, barring abusing your children, of course, that's not permissible. That's why you have children's services. But for the government to step in and say, you're going to let your little boy be a girl, whether you like it or not. I mean, this is an infringement on your rights. It's an infringement on the sanctity of the family. And so these are very dangerous signs that we see going on. And also the blind eye that we see going on in various states across the U.S., where for what we saw, for example, in Minneapolis and in Seattle as well, where the mayor of Seattle said, oh, it's going to be a summer of love. And it ended up with murder and all types of crime and so forth. And so the protesters who were against Trump building a wall built their own walls in Chaz, and had their own people, monitoring who was coming in and going out. So they were doing the very things they were condemning the federal government for doing. So we see this coming, not just in the United States, but it's popping up here in Canada as well. It's going on in Australia. It's going on in the United Kingdom and so forth. So this type of thinking, which tries to suppress Christian thought, not just Christian thought, but particularly Christian thought, because again, they wouldn't say, okay, we're going to vet the sermons of the imam of the local mosque, who calls for the death of homosexuals and so forth, and the death of Jews and Christians. They won't vet those. They're not going to vet the local Hindu temple or the synagogue. They want to see what Christians are saying. And that's why you will notice that some groups, like the ACLU, ACLU, I call them Atheist Communist Liberals United. And those guys will actually came out when there was the Orlando shooter. I don't know if you remember, when the Muslim went in and shot up all these homosexuals in a gay bar. The ACLU actually blamed Christian fundamentalism for that, which is very strange, because this guy did everything in the name of Allah. and based on his Islamic worldview. So we're living in very perilous days, almost Book of Revelation type days, where Christianity is they're under the microscope.
So you have all that too, and then you even have, I mean, just general internet censorship as well. You know, when you post things surrounding these type of values, or a Christian speaking out about a certain topic. I mean, even David Wood's videos, you see how he constantly gets taken down. Apostate Prophet, YouTube wouldn't even send him his plaque for hitting like 200,000 subscribers. They don't want to be the ones to push this because it's so bad for PR, and because we're all living in this culture in which we cower to this 2%. Now, I'm not saying they're right or wrong just because they're a small number, but the point is we walk around as if this shadow on the wall is the real boogeyman when it's really just this small little thing being illuminated against it. And so, it's definitely very interesting. And, I mean, that's why, especially because I know a lot of my listeners aren't even from America, but for those of us here, that's why it really is important how the rest of this year plays out, because we've already seen the patterns. So if we've already seen the patterns, then how much more so depending on how things go from here on out. And you're right. We can't cower. We have to stand for that truth, because it always starts with that small amount. And the next thing you know, the persecution grows and grows. And, you're being forced out of your church. You're being forced out of these places of worship because it doesn't conform to what society says is politically correct. That's right.
Well, don't be surprised, Io, if this video gets banned or something, because David Woods got banned because he mentioned Christian persecution.
I saw that video.
In Muslim countries. And it was all based on statistics and facts. And they still try to shut him down. I remember posting something on Facebook on the reason why Christ came into the world to save sinners and so forth. Facebook flagged that as hate speech. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was flagged by Facebook as hate speech. So when Twitter bans President Trump from tweeting, and don't get me wrong, he's a pretty crass person sometimes when it comes to tweeting. But when you ban the president of the United States and you allow the Ayatollah of Iran to come out and call for the decimation and annihilation of Israel, we got a problem, Houston. We got a huge problem. We have a huge problem here. Yeah.
So if we try to look at more of the Islamic side of it as well, let me see if I can pull up another headline here. Let's do, I got a bunch here. This is an interesting one, but it's Uganda. So it says, Uganda, pastor, church member beaten and drowned in retaliation for evangelizing Muslims. So just going off of the headline, it seems like, radical Muslims beat and drowned a 25-year-old pastor and a 22-year-old church member for preaching the gospel to them. Murder occurred on June 22nd. Yeah, so, especially when we see these type of things, in Uganda and things like that, one thing that I've constantly wanted to just scream from the rooftops, and I have been in a way, but most people don't even want to listen, is this idea of how, we were talking about BLM and all of these things that they're standing for, and just all the chaos that they're causing in the streets. And, I look at it and I say to myself, well, I get that, it's a domestic organization, but if the goal is really to just help the community, if the goal is really to just help end, this unnecessary injustice, oppression, whatever you want to call it, then why don't we ever see it? Why don't we ever see these groups calling out Islam? Because in fact, especially predominantly within the Black community, you see how Islam is actually infiltrated it. I mean, back to guys Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, up until even now, many unfortunately are buying into it. And yet they don't even realize that, for example, I mean, I never learned this in school, but, regarding the slave trade, they're so quick to say how, it was the white colonial, person who bought and sold the slaves and they brought them to America. And it's like, yes, that's true in a sense, but it's so crazy how they always conveniently leave out the part that the colonists almost never had to actually go into the mainland, because every time they came to shore, the Africans were almost always waiting for them in cages there, because Muslims had rounded them up, and they would trade them for little trinkets like guns, jewelry, whatever, and ship them off to America. And then some would go eastward toward the Middle East, and so you never hear those type of things mentioned. So
no,
I feel like, so again, I think it comes back to that idea of consistency, where it's like, if you're not gonna call out that consistency where it needs to be, then how can I take you seriously in the areas where you do call it out?
Right.
So I don't
Right.
know. That's just a bit of a rant, but what are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
yeah, that's a fair point. That's a fair point, and I'm glad you brought that up because you see, again, the narrative is it's attack the West, attack Western civilization, attack Christianity. So even though the Muslims started the slave trade centuries before the Europeans did in the transatlantic slave trade, no one talks about the Muslim slave trade. No one talks about African tribes that enslaved other African tribes and sold them to Muslims and the Europeans. So you're right. Uh, the Muslims, but also African tribesmen who
Mm-hmm.
saw other tribes as inferior,
Yeah.
they took them as captives and they made money off of them as well. So, for example, President Obama, if you follow his ancestry through his father, the tribe that they came from, his father was Kenyan, but the tribe that they came from actually uh, uh, owned slaves and sold them to
Yeah.
Europeans. And even Kamala Harris on her father's
Yeah.
side,
Right.
he
Yeah.
he actually held one of the largest slave plantations in Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
No one talks about this, and so she's not an aggrieved person. I mean, she's partly Jamaican, partly Indian, but for her to claim that she's this African American, which she is not, and that she is oppressed, which she is not, because again, her ancestry gave her what she is today. If you really follow the line, but the point here is that here's this pastor in Uganda who is basically killed. That doesn't make frontline news. And you think about the fact, well, why was he killed? Well, because one of the things that we encounter in Muslim countries is it is illegal to proselytize. So in their legislation, they have laws in place that basically say that it is illegal to proselytize. Again, no freedom of religion. Now, let me ask this question, Niall. In the
Mm-hmm.
United States, are Muslims given the freedom to proselytize and convert people to Islam?
Yep.
All the time. I mean, you even have CARE, the Council of
Yeah.
American Islamic Relations,
Some people
and
did
they made
something.
it very, yeah, they made it very clear. They look for the day when the United States will come under Sharia law. So they've made their agenda very clear. We want to see the United States become an Islamic state, and we know they're part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that there's a constitution that they talk about destroying the West from within, and that's exactly what they're doing. So in Western countries, the UK, Canada, the United States, Australia, Western Europe, in all of these countries, Muslims are proselytizing. They are taking the liberties that the West affords them, and they're using it to expand Islam. In Muslim countries, you're not even allowed to do that.
Yeah.
It is highly illegal to go into Pakistan or to go into Saudi Arabia or Uganda in this case. And if you really look at the map of Africa, if you look at the north of Africa, Libya, Sudan, and Egypt, and so forth, Mauritania, all of these countries in that northern region, you'll notice they're all Muslim. To the south, of course, that's where you find Christians to the south, and that is deliberate, and that is because when Islam came into the continent of Africa, it took over all of the north. All of the North Africa became Muslim. And the irony here is that someone like Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, who converted to Islam,
Yeah.
and he did so because he bought into this rhetoric that the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, or at that time Elijah Muhammad, he bought into this rhetoric about a white Jesus and a white Christianity and a white man's religion and that type of stuff. And unfortunately, he said, well, that's why I became a Muslim. And I'm thinking, my heavens, I mean, don't you know anything about Muhammad? Muhammad owned and sold black slaves. And you know what's interesting, Ayo? Do you know what the Arabic word for a black person is?
I feel like I might have heard it, but I can't remember right now.
Yeah, it's abid, Abeed. And the Arabic word abid means slave.
Oh, wow.
So the Arabic word, when they talk about a black person, they will refer to them as an abid. Well, where did they get this from?
Yeah, just by default.
Yeah, exactly. And because Muhammad owned and sold black slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So for Muhammad Ali to say, well, I'm going to become a Muslim because I feel that this is my people's religion. No. In fact, if you look at the Islamic sources, they don't have a lot of nice things to say about African Americans or Africans and so forth. So a lot of it is information is power, right? Knowledge is power. And what we see here is, like you pointed out earlier, there's this inconsistency. And truth is always consistent with itself. That's how we know someone is lying, for example, is if their testimony doesn't add up, if there's holes in their testimony. And the thing about the message of Jesus is that if you look at his message, there's a consistency that runs through his message. When you look at the Bible, Old and New Testament, there's a thread that runs through it that is consistent. But you see, groups like, Black Lives Matter and also all Marxist groups don't believe in objective truth. There is no objective meaning. And therefore, since there's no objective truth, then it must be subjective. So I don't know if you've been watching on Twitter recently. There was this thing on Twitter where they're all saying 2 and 2 does not equal 4. 2 and 2 equals 5.
Because they were saying like math is racist or something like that, right?
Yeah, math it's white mathematics. White. Since when is math white? White mathematics, and then science, the whole scientific method is all white. And the just think about that for a minute. 2 and 2 is not 4. 2 and 2 is 5. So when words don't mean what they mean, and when truth is no longer central and objective, we've now entered into the world of chaos. There is no meaning, no purpose, and so all of these groups that you see out there today, it's not about truth over power. The way I define these groups, like social justice groups, is power over truth.
Yeah.
It's all about power over truth. They don't care about truth. Truth to them is a social construct. Logic is a social construct, and it's simply chatter. It's all about power. That's why they don't want to debate you. Like, they won't come on and say, okay, let's have a discussion, a dialogue on these things. Because what they'll do is, when I try to have a discussion with these people, they say, you're a racist, you're a Nazi scum, you're this, you're that, you've got privilege. And so it goes into this epithet attack. They start throwing these epithets at you. And that's because they're not interested in truth, because truth is always consistent with itself.
One question I wanted to pull up here from a commentator, and it kind of goes back to what you're mentioning about the proselytizing. You're right. In America, Muslims have that right. They have it in Europe as well. And I think Western Europe, in a lot of ways, really kind of has gone before America in a lot of the trends that we see. And so there's a question here from Takia Watch TV, which says, what is Dr. Costa's prediction about the future of Europe in the coming decades? In what context he's referring to, I don't know. But it was just making me think about, you have, so many of these districts in these countries, are just becoming overrun by Muslims. Not because we hate them because of their ethnicity or anything, but just because of the ideology. And so you see the ideology spreading throughout Europe. The church there is basically dead. It's on life support. A lot of people that I see that tune into like my church live streams, they're coming from Western Europe because half of the places they're closed. They're not really teaching the word. And so you see this complete starvation and this malnourishment of biblical truth, and then this total influence and saturation of Islam. I don't know. What's your kind of take on that? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think when we think of Europe, let's really think this through. When we think of Europe, Europe was really the hub, the center of some of the greatest events in history. We think of, for example, the Protestant Reformation, 1517 in Germany. We think of the Magna Carta, 1215 in the UK. We think of the revival that God brought about through John Calvin in Geneva, Switzerland, and then John Knox in Scotland, and then with John Wesley in England, and then in the Americas as well. George Whitefield coming to the Americas and preaching the gospel there. Europe has been really a blessing to the world, but isn't it sad that the very area, the very continent from which God raised up these reformers and so forth, they were the first to go head first into things like higher criticism and adopting the whole Enlightenment philosophy that man is the summit of all things. And it's sad to see that the UK, for example, which is really our maternal country, like in terms of the origins of your country and my country, even though we're still part of the Commonwealth, we're connected to the Queen. The United States, of course, was brought about from the colonies, the British colonies. And what we're seeing is, if you follow the trend very carefully, the downslide began when they started to accept liberalism, and they started to deny biblical authority. Once biblical authority went out the window, you'll notice there was everything nosedived. And the same thing's happening here in North America. Now, what do I think was going on in Europe? I think that the incursion of Muslims into Europe is deliberate. It's not just, oh, we're looking for a better job. The Quran says very clearly that if you migrate to an unbelieving nation, it must be for the purpose of expanding Allah's religion. In other words, it's for the purpose of the expansion of Islam. And I think the late Muammar Gaddafi, who was the leader of Libya, put it correctly. He said, we will not take over Europe and the West by the sword. We will destroy them by the womb, W-O-M-B. And what he meant was by the birth rates. So in Europe today, the birth rates among Europeans has declined. And add abortion to the foray. Abortion has contributed to the decimation of people, of future Europeans, for example. But the Muslim population in Europe, the average Muslim family has 6 to 8 children. Now, just do the math. In 50 years or 100 years or so, the demographics of Europe is going to change. Because while European birth rates plummet, the Muslim birth rates increase. Same with North America. And so because the West has been so proud of so-called women's rights and pushed abortion, a lot of women have aborted their children. And of course, in Islam, this is not something that Muslims generally do. In Islam, what you find is there's this increase in the birth rate. So in about 50 years or so, take, for example, the United Kingdom. The number one baby name in the United Kingdom was Muhammad.
Wow.
I mean, it wasn't Philip or William or Andrew. It was Muhammad was the number one baby name in the UK. Well, what does that tell you about demographics? So I think that if God does not spare Europe, if God does not provide grace to bring another revival, I think Europe may likely become an Islamic continent.
Yeah,
because that's their vision. That's what they've been saying. And in fact, it almost did become an Islamic continent were it not for the Crusades. So the Crusades, which were a 400-year response to the Islamic invasions, no one talks about that. All it is these mean Christians going and beating people up and raping women and taking the Holy Land. They were responding to the Islamic incursions into the West. And were it not for them, Europe would still be speaking Arabic today. So I'm not very optimistic about Europe. I think we're going to see a very, very dangerous twist coming to Europe if God does not show mercy.
Yeah, that answer honestly is spot on. It's exactly what I was thinking. And so then if I could bring it a bit more west, you might essentially say the same thing, but for different reasons. But then what would your take be on kind of, North America, and Canada, the United States? What direction do you really see? I know a lot of it too will kind of depend on how November goes. Yes. But why don't you give me both scenarios? So, and I don't want to say this as if it's a done deal, but just in your eye, depending on how November goes, depending on how things play out, what direction do you see North America going in?
I think that what happens in the United States has a tremendous effect on what goes on, not just north of the border, but in the world as a whole. Now, again, I'm not saying Donald Trump is perfect. No one is perfect. But what I am saying is that comparing his administration to what the Democrats have to offer now, again, you need to understand that the Democratic Party was the pro-slavery party. They were the party that fought against the North, the Lincoln basically, and the North, and the Yankees, so to speak. They fought to try to keep slavery in the South. And it was also from the Democratic Party that they created the Ku Klux Klan. It was created by the Democratic Party. And if you look at all of these cities where you've seen all of this chaos, Seattle and Minneapolis and Detroit and Chicago, they're all run by Democrats. They're all Democrat states. And what I have found is that even African Americans within the Democratic Party are not really there to protect the African American community. They're there because they're elected by them, and they're there because they are filling their pockets. They are becoming very rich out of this ordeal. You you look at Reverend Al Sharpton, for example, who goes around claiming that he's a voice for African Americans, and yet he's extremely wealthy. He asked for a lot of money to preach at, I think, George Floyd's service, and from what I've heard, he still hasn't paid back taxes. But the point here is that looking at President Trump, even though I'm Canadian, so I'm speaking as an outsider.
Yeah.
Looking at President Trump and looking at Joe Biden, and then Kamala Harris, and I'm thinking, the Democrats are the party of abortion. They're pro-choice. They call it a woman's right. They're pro-LGBTQ. They're pro-transgenderism, and so the only conservative shield that the United States has right now, maintaining its history and maintaining its dignity, I don't see that in anyone else but the current president of Donald Trump. So however it goes in November, I think that if you end up with a Democratic administration, I think things are going to deteriorate very, very quickly. And I think we have to step back. I mean, our government is just as corrupt. Our government does not even believe, I mean, our prime minister believes that we should have a no border world, a world without borders. Yeah. And we should have a globalist village. And he's pro-abortion and pro-LGBTQ. It's the same thing. He's the Canadian version of Obama. And so I think what's happening in North America today, I think that it is an act of judgment. I do think we're under judgment. I think God is bringing judgment on us. But I pray that God would relent from his anger and his wrath. And I pray that God would bring revival. It can happen. We've seen it before. God did this through Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and a number of other men and women of God that he raised up, not just in the United States, but in Europe and Canada and so forth. So I think we are a nation under judgment. How do I know that? Well, if you look at our world today, you'll notice that the world seems to be caught up in this delusion. Like you look at the world and you go, are these people losing their minds?
Am I the one who's going crazy?
Yeah,
or is this...
am I on crazy pills? Like, what's going on here? And so you have to look at the world and you say, wait a minute, it up is down and down is up, and there's no sense or rhyme. I mean, just yesterday I'm teaching a course on social justice, and I was sharing with my students how we had a banner, a promo piece that was put out by the Canadian Cancer Society, and it was talking about cervical cancer, and they had the picture of a man who identified as a woman. It was a man with a wig and so forth, and then it says, what can we do to fight cervical cancer? And I'm thinking to myself, men don't have cervixes. How does a man get help for cervical cancer? It's like me saying that a woman has prostate cancer. Women don't have prostates. And so, but this is the Cancer Society, which is a charitable organization. And I'm thinking, are you kidding me? I mean, you're actually putting a man, a transvestite, a transgender woman, putting it out there in a promo piece for cervical cancer. What an insult to women who actually have suffered and died of cervical cancer. So you look at this and go, oh my heavens, are these people losing their mind? And then I think about that passage in 2 Thessalonians that says, God will send them a strong delusion that they may believe a lie so that they will be judged. And so has God handed us over? It seems like it. I pray for mercy. I pray for grace. And the church needs to wake up, because the church, for the most part, is like the ostrich with its head in the sand.
Yeah, that's so true. And the thing is, too, about the strong delusion, like that specific act, I don't even think that specific act has happened yet. I think right now God is just he's just letting us do our thing, and that alone has been enough to bring us to where we are now. So it's incredibly crazy. And regarding revival, times like this really are when the rubber meets the road, because we've been pampered, so to speak, and we haven't had to deal with what many people in these Muslim majority countries have to deal with on a daily basis. And so when push comes to shove and you do start to see people take a stand for truth and really not cower, it's a great sign, but it actually results in more persecution. So in a weird kind of way, more persecution actually means that, I don't want to say more people are becoming Christians, but that the church is standing strong there. So, for example, a comment here, and I know you know this: huge numbers of Muslims converting to Christianity in the Middle East, revival happening already. That's entirely true. There's so many converting. Yes. But for every one that converts, there's an entire regime ready to bring the hammer down on them and to persecute them. And so, I mean, I've even just casually scrolling the news, Christian news, because you won't hear it in the mainstream, but just even casually scrolling, I've been noticing how many more stories you hear about this persecution. And to me,
that's right.
That is also a sign that, things really are heating up and we're really getting closer to that point. Because even God doesn't have an infinite amount of patience. Even he has that point where he says, okay,
That's
it's
right.
time to take the stand against this. And so we see that there already. Now, how things play out here in the West, I mean, I don't know, but I think if they do take a turn for the worst, you will also see, I mean, I don't know exactly what the persecution is going to look like, but I do think it'll definitely be more, I guess the word would be just kind of like arrogant in a way, what I mean? Where it's like, oh, well, you have to, you can't go to this worship service, or you can't buy this because of a post you made last week that violated our community guidelines. I really think that's the future, where everything that you do in life is going to be tied to how you essentially behave for the culture. And as Christians, we by nature aren't going to fall in line with that. And so everything going on now with, the churches closing has already shown that. And so as things heat up, I mean, who even knows? Because like I said, I mean, like when Trump won in 2016, I mean, I think all of us kind of knew it was going to be crazy, but none of us really knew it was going to be this crazy.
Yeah.
And if things have been crazy, even with him in power, even with, just all this going on, imagine once, I mean, if Biden wins or what, imagine how things will then go for the Christian minority in this nation. Because unfortunately, as I said, when the rubber meets the road, many people are going to stand for truth, and then many are also going to falter. There are many people who never really Christians at all that are just going to cower and get to the mob. And so it really does create this division. Many people will say to me, they're like, well, why do you like so-and-so? They're so divisive. And I'm like, well, look, truth by necessity is divisive, because Jesus himself even said he came to bring a sword, not to kill people, but to divide, meaning one person to stand and another person doesn't like that. And that's exactly what you see with the persecution. So we see all the telltale signs. I'm no prophet, neither are you, but Jesus also told us to be aware of the signs, and the signs are there. So
yeah. Well, there is a correlation between persecution and church growth. Isn't that what we see throughout the Bible? Isn't that what we see in the book of Acts? Once the early church started being persecuted, you'll notice they started growing. They started growing, snowballing, actually. And so wherever there's been persecution, you'll notice the church is the strongest. Where there is no persecution, the church becomes complacent rather, and the church begins to wane. It gets lazy. So for example, where are the two main areas in the world today, or which are the main areas in the world today where Christianity is mushrooming? Africa, the continent of Africa, in China, and in the Muslim countries like Iran and others. And so why is this happening? Because there's persecution. And therefore, God does, in his divine will and counsel, God does permit persecution to come, because as the early church father, I believe it was Tertullian or Justin Martyr, said that the blood of Christians is seed. The more you spill, the more they grow. And so what you find is that when there is no persecution, so look at the church for the first 300 years of its history. It began to grow across the world, the known world. And then in 313, Constantine declares Christianity to be a religio licita, a licit religion, a religion that should be respected and so forth. And then when the whole empire went Christian, so to speak, you'll notice that Christians began to, their fervor began to wane, because they were in the place of power now in the kingdom or in the empire. And so what ends up happening is that in the United States and Canada, when we don't have persecution, what do we have? Well, we have we have this "what would Jesus do" type attitude, and we have these little cliquey clubs, and
I just made a video on. Oh my goodness!
Pastors with skinny jeans preaching on a Sunday morning. You know what I'm talking about? This new fad and so forth, and so persecution is also a time where God will begin to divide. He will begin to separate the chaff from the wheat. He'll separate the tares from the wheat. He'll separate the sheep from the goats. And it's a weeding out. This is how God weeds out those who are refined. And that's what you're seeing. This is exactly what you're saying. Those who stand for Christ will say, no compromise. We will not compromise. It's not Caesar and Christ. It's Christ over Caesar. Christ is King. Christ is Lord. Those who would compromise will say, well, we're not supposed to offend anybody. We're supposed to love everybody. And, Christians should not be sharing the gospel with politicians because, our kingdom is not of this world.
Yeah.
And so they have this attitude. And so, the term I use for these people, I call them evangelifishes. They're not evangelicals. They're evangelifishes because jellyfish don't have spines. And so, unfortunately, the genuine Christians and the professing Christians are coming up. Now, remember, Jesus had 12 apostles, and one of them was really not a genuine believer, right? And he walked with the Lord for 3 years. He heard his voice. He saw his miracles. He ate with them. They spent time together. And yet, at the end of the day, what did Jesus say? He said, one of you is a diabolos, is a devil, and one of you shall betray me. So there's a lot of people in our churches today who, like Judas Iscariot, hear the word of God. They've heard it. They've tasted of the heavenly gift. They have seen God work in people's lives and so forth. But at the end of the day, when temptation comes, when persecution comes, they become overwhelmed with the things of this world and they fall away. So, we're seeing a great apostasy in the church today as well. Not just theologically, but we are seeing a great apostasy in the church in terms of morality, in terms of ethics. And it all comes down to the same thing. What happened in Europe? They rejected Scripture as God's voice and as God's ultimate authority to his church. And whenever that happens, what you end up with is what we see today.
That's so true. You really know that. And to make it a bit more, not personal for me, but just personal in terms of the Christian walk, it is so crucial to, I mean, this is why Jesus, put so much emphasis on how we live, because if we, in the comfort of our lifestyle here and now in the West, can't share the gospel, can't stand for truth, can't do these things that we know are required of us, there's no way we're going to be able to stand when things really do begin to get tough.
Right.
It's like the offense against us is up here, but our defense is way here, and we're expecting to be able to stand strong, and it can't happen. That's why in my video a few weeks back, I was kind of ranting about that, and I said, it's so easy to constantly watch these type of live streams that people on YouTube do and know all these things intellectually, but ultimately, if you're not out there, sharing the gospel, not, being rude or whatever, but if you're not being intentional and direct and sharing the gospel, living out your faith and taking a stand for truth when things are easy, there's no way any sane person could expect you to do the same thing or to do it at all when things do get tough. And so we need to take ourselves out of this ivory tower bubble, especially in a lot of that mainstream, skinny jeans type of Christianity, where it's all about keeping up with what's cool and just making, they orchestrate it in a way where they want to attract the world rather than just doing it for God and letting the world respond however they want. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people are not understanding. So for example, when it comes to sharing the gospel, I ranted about this in the video. I'll do it one more time, but you might have heard this quote a lot where people will say things like, "Oh, preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words." And I know the intent of those quotes is basically to say your actions should supplement your words, and that's true. But unfortunately, many people hear that, and my friends and I, we ran about this. They hear that, and what they do is in the back of their minds, they go, "Oh," they breathe a sigh of relief. They go, "Thank goodness, I don't have to share my faith. I just have to be a good person, and then people will ask me why I'm different." And I'm like, look, on the day of Pentecost, when the disciples gathered that huge crowd after speaking all the foreign languages by the power of the Spirit, what did they say? Did they say, "Okay, guys, we got this huge crowd. Now let's just be nice to everyone and hope they ask us why we're different"? No. And I said it's just as important then as it's just as important now as it was then. So I said, look, I know it's uncomfortable. I know it's a fearful thing, but if you can't even hang through this, I'm not saying it's easy, but you have to choose to push through it. How are you going to be able to stand when they close your church or when they say, "Hey, if you're a Christian, you can't work here," or whatever it may be? You're going to give in. And so,
Romans 10:17, right? Romans 10:17. Faith comes by hearing. And hearing by the word of Christ, the word of God. And therefore, faith doesn't come by observing someone walking an old lady across the street. That is a charitable work. Wow, that guy must be a Christian. Well, Mormons do that as well. Mormons and atheists, and some atheists are philanthropists. They're humanitarian. They give to charity, but they're lost. They don't know Christ. And so faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. And therefore, when the apostles preached, they weren't using sign language. They were preaching. They were speaking. right? I mean, if you followed Paul's way of life, I mean, Paul lost it on Barnabas because of Mark abandoning the mission and so forth. I mean, I'm sure Paul looked back at that, and he did. He eventually reconciled, but I'm sure Paul said, "Boy, I wasn't very nice to Barnabas when I lost it on him." But that's not what faith is produced by. Faith is produced by the Word of God, and I agree with you that, I mean, the cults are putting us to shame. I mean, the
Yeah.
Jehovah's Witnesses are doing what we should be doing, and they are willing to put their reputation on the line for a gospel that they think is authentic, which is not, but they're willing to do it because they think it's true. And yet Christians, we have this great opportunity. We have a huge ministry outside our doorstep. Like when Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't come to my door anymore because apparently I've been blacklisted. And I don't know if I can even say black anymore, blacklisted, because then I'm going to, no, you're being racist or something. But anyway, they come they don't come here anymore. But when they do, I take opportunity to share the gospel with them. When I meet Muslims, I try to take the opportunity to share the gospel with them. And, the problem with a lot of Christians today is and that's why it's such a cop-out to use that line that it's usually attributed to St. Francis of Assisi. But to use that line is basically a cop-out to say, well, I don't have to preach. I'll just let them look at my behavior. Yeah, and your behavior kind of sucks. It doesn't really look very Christian.
Hey,
so you see,
speaking so much truth, man. I don't know. It's too much.
Yeah, man. I mean, with me, like, Paul would say, I am the chief of sinners, man.
Yeah.
I am the least of the apostles. But I am what I am by the grace of God. And so you're absolutely right. The preaching of the gospel is central. And that's the Great Commission. Go and make disciples of the nations and, teach them everything that I've commanded you. So, I'm sure you share the same burden I do. You look at a lot of these churches, and instead of being fishers of men, they become keepers of the aquarium. They have all the fish. The fish are in the aquarium, and they go, "Hey, we're going to feed them. How you doing there? Hey, Goldie, how you doing? How are you doing?" And so we keep them in that aquarium, and we just take care of them instead of going out and being fishers of men. Going out to seek and save the lost. So yeah, we're not. A lot of Christians, they're not doing too good today. They're not doing too good.
That's so true. I even tell my buddies, like, I've been blessed to have met like some awesome Christian guys that I've been hanging out with, and like it's been going really well. But even when we hang out, I tell them, I say, as great as it is to be able to like talk with you guys and have these conversations and relate over these things, ultimately this is kind of like it's kind of like a sedation. It's like an ivory tower. It's not real. You know what I mean? The real thing is the world out there that's suffering and it needs to hear the truth. And so I said, as great as it is to be able to talk with you guys, we can never lose sight of that. We can't stay in the aquarium. We have to go out into the open ocean, face the sharks, face the predators.
That's right.
It's important.
That's right.
And so, we went through some of these headlines. We talked about some of these things, and the inclination can be to kind of subconsciously think of them as like this kind of bad thing, like, oh, like I can't believe, they suffered like that. Yeah, I mean, it hurts. I bet it sucked in the moment, but this is why Christ said that, it's a joy when we're persecuted. And that's why he promised that we'd be persecuted, not because we have to enjoy the pain or anything, but because it's a sign that we actually stand for something and that we actually.
That's right.
I tell my friends, I say, when it hurts, when you're going through it and you're facing that oppression or whatever it may be, that's a sign that's when you feel the most alive, because that's when you're actually taking a stand for something and fighting for something.
That's right.
You may feel comfortable.
Yeah, the apostles in Acts 5 walk away after they've been scourged, and it says they were rejoicing that they deemed themselves worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. And I would highly recommend. I don't know if you've ever read the book "Tortured for Christ" by Richard Wurmbrand, who was a Romanian pastor under communist rule, the Soviet communist rule in Romania. And this was a pastor who was very faithful to the Word of God and preached to the Russian soldiers and so forth. And this guy went into prison, solitary confinement for 3 years without seeing the outside world, just in this little cell for 3 years. I mean, average people would lose their minds there. And his wife was in prison. They beat him up almost every day. His feet were so badly beaten that he couldn't even properly walk. And his life was a life of testimony. He saw prisoners saved. Even the guy who was torturing him, I think he ended up being a Christian as well. Wow. Because he just couldn't believe. I mean, at the end, this torturer said to him, look, he said, you've lost everything. You lost your church, you lost your wife, you lost your kids. And why do you keep praying? And then he said, I'm praying for you. Think about that. He was praying for his tormentor. And it's I'll tell you something, Io. The people that are remembered in history are only those who've made a difference.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done my share of funerals as a minister, and when I'm at graveyards, you see these tombstones, and there are people here who loved and had joy, and who shared life, and who cried, and who had children, and so forth and so on. And yet so many of them are just forgotten. Their names become eroded over time. You don't even know who's buried in that plot anymore. I mean, is that what we're going to be at the end of our lives? Just an eroded name on a tombstone? Remember, the only ones who are remembered in history are those who've made a difference. And so, if I say Martin Luther King, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If I say Martin Luther, the reformer, or John Calvin, bang, you'll know what I'm talking about. So it's those who've made a difference. And my philosophy is this, that if I can make a difference in one person's life, then I've lived my life to the full. Yeah, just one person. So really, the only thing that matters at the end of the day is those who do the will of God. The one who does the will of God abides forever. Amen. Everything else is fleeting. Everything
Amen.
else is fleeting.
That's like exactly the same note that we ended on last time. We were talking about that, and I said, I'm 20 now, and barely 2-3 years ago, I remember thinking to myself, dang, I don't want Jesus to come back, because I want to get married, I want to have a career and do all this stuff. And not even joking, I'm just at the point now where I look around this world and I think about my life and just all these things, and I say to myself, as great as those things may be, it only lasts for a moment, and it is hard, especially at my age, having those influences around me. But you really start to really consider and just remember that living for God is truly what's going to matter, because as great as it may feel in the moment, all it is a moment, and those moments,
it's so temporary. True. It's so true. I mean, I'm 53 now, but there's people around me that I've known who passed away, and you're beginning to hear more and more of them. And it's a reminder that you're slowly getting to that category. And the more I reflect on my life and I look back, I begin to realize that really everything that we do, the only thing that matters is what we do for the sake of Christ. Because really, when you think about it, all of history is moving in one trajectory, isn't it? It's moving to one point, one zenith point, and that is the glory of God. Because how does the whole story end? Every knee will bow, every tongue will confess Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And so the magnification of God's glory and his glorious name is what we live for. Isn't that what Jesus said? I've come to do the will of him who sent me, to glorify his name. And so it really gives meaning to life. And you begin to see what the preacher of Ecclesiastes 1 was talking about when he said, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Everything's done under the sun. Anything that is has already been. There's really nothing new. And so that is something that I think we need to stay focused on, because with this whole epidemic, the coronavirus epidemic, I think Hebrews 12:2 is so important right now, that we need to look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. If we take our eyes off of him, we're going to be like Peter when he tried to walk on the water, and he looked around and he saw the waves and the darkness. He began to sink. And we take our eyes off the target, we're going to sink. And so I think it's important that we remain grounded right now. And our prayer every day should be, Lord, what is your will for me today? What do you want me to do this day? This is your day. Every day is your day. This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice, be glad in it. What is it that you would have me do?
Amen. So just to end it, when you guys look at these headlines and you see, so-and-so killed for their faith, or so-and-so, suffers at the hands of persecution, or whatever it may be, the temptation is to feel sorry, is to think that we have it better, and in a way we do, because we get to see a new day and we have a new opportunity. But at the same time, we should also be asking ourselves, how is that person living their life that put them on the radar? How are they taking a stand in ways that I've fallen short of? How were they living for Christ so much so that it got them noticed by others who disagreed? And I think when you really start to think like that, it can revolutionize how you see suffering? Because at the end of the day, when it comes to apologetics and all these intellectual questions, I mean, in my opinion, I think the most prevalent question in apologetics is, if God, why suffering? And it is an intellectual question, but at its core, it's also an emotional one, which shows that all the intellect in the world can't really bring us any closer to God than, being a theologian can get you out of hell. It's about your relationship with him. And so when you look at these things, don't see it as if, they're worse off and you're better off, or whatever it may be. See it as a learning experience, as an opportunity as to how you can live your life better for the glory of God, because that person has left their mark in the stone. And while we may have a new opportunity to do so, that doesn't mean that we will. And so we can't always bank on the fact that we'll do those things. And so, Tony, you nailed it. Great talk. Great, awesome points.
Thank you.
Made. For everyone else to watch it. And yeah, ladies and gentlemen, just be sure to check out his Facebook page, his courses in the description that he's going to be teaching in the coming weeks. He's doing a lot of really good work. And so just be on the lookout for that. And thank you all so much for tuning in. Be sure to leave a comment, letting me know what you thought, hit the like button, and yeah, be sure to subscribe and share the video. So thank you guys so much. Stay safe out there, and I will catch you very soon. See ya.